Good evening. Welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, and answering your questions tonight, journalist and commentator Jennifer Hewett, the Minister for Trade, Craig Emerson, former federal opposition leader Mark Latham, Saudi Arabia's first female filmmaker Haifaa Al-Mansour, who's in Australia to present her new film Wajah at the Sydney Film Festival, and the Shadow Minister for Communications Malcolm Turnbull in his celebrated leather jacket. Please welcome our panel. As usual, we're being simulcast on ABC News 24 and News Radio, and you can join the Twitter conversation with the Quanda hashtag. Our first question comes from John Brax.
With Labor headed for a complete obliteration in September, isn't it time for Julia to take one for the party, resign as leader and give someone else in the party the chance to resuscitate the hope that Labor will not become a small minority party and that Tony Abbott will not be the next Prime Minister?
Craig Emerson.
No. No, Julia's doing a terrific job. She's implementing really important reforms. We've been running an economy that's resilient, it's growing faster than every major advanced country. 28 million people have lost their jobs around the world in the last few years. At that same time, nearly 1 million jobs have been created here. But on the social side, massive reforms, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, putting a price on carbon. She's had the courage to do that.
Have you been reading the papers?
I'm just telling you what Julia Gillard is doing.
But
and they are important reforms. They are important reforms, and if I could finish, incredibly important education reforms to make sure that no one is left behind.
Do you know what's going on behind the scenes? Because every front page today has a story that there's an organisation going on to oust Julia Gillard. Most people are pointing at Victoria, and those that are in the know seem to be suggesting Bill Shorten's involved.
Well, I've seen all the media chatter, there's no doubt about that, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that the media makes this stuff up.
I'm so glad.
They obviously are getting briefed by people who have a different view as to who the leader should be. There's no doubt about that. It's not media speculation, but the fact is, I do my due diligence too when I see these reports. Nothing is actually going on in terms of action. Plenty of talk, no doubt about that.
But if they're being...
And our opponent is Tony Abbott, and that's who we should be concentrating on.
If they are being briefed by people allied to, or Bill Shorten himself, that a change is on the way...
Well, they're not.
How do you know that?
Because Bill Shorten approached a number of journalists to clarify that he supports the Prime Minister, and the reports who suggest maybe he doesn't are wrong.
Let's go to Jennifer Hewett. Has that been clarified completely, do you think?
Well, I think Bill Shorten said that he is behind the Prime Minister, but I think it's fairly clear that a lot of people who did back Julia Gillard are terrified at the polls, and that there's a lot of change going on, a lot of motion. As yet, I think it's kind of impossible to say whether or not that's going to lead to a change. But certainly, it's not just the media making this up, and it's also not just the people we know, want Kevin back and have known for some time. There's a lot of uncertainty in the Labor Party. They look at the polls, they know this is their last chance, and they're thinking very hard about whether to make the move.
Mark Latham, the questioner asked whether it is time for Julia Gillard to make her decision to go.
Well, to stand down would be to reward a saboteur. Kevin Rudd sabotaged Labor's campaign in 2010 through his vengeful leaks to Laurie Oakes and Peter Harcher. And since then, what do you say about Rudd? Anyone who gets into a leadership position in politics runs the risk of a serious loss and a period of hurt. I felt it in 2004. Malcolm can talk about his experience in losing the Liberal leadership. But I think the normal reaction is that for 12 to 18 months, you feel a sharpness, perhaps a desire to thrash out at those that you blame, but then you move on. But what you've had from Rudd has gone well beyond 12 to 18 months. It's 3 years of concerted revenge. He knows that every day that he gets in the media cycle, he's knocking Gillard down a notch or two in the polls. This is a program, a jihad of revenge, the like of which we've never seen before in the history of Australian politics. And it goes beyond the normal human reaction of revenge. You're getting into the realm of evil here with Rudd, the realm of evil, with someone who has gone well beyond normal practice in politics, has split his party in two.
I'm going to have to pull you up on the question of evil.
Well,
because
that
seems so way beyond the pale.
Tony, you think about
someone's ambition to be Prime Minister equates to evil.
You're getting now into the sabotage of a second Labor campaign, not just turning them from a 20-seat majority to the torture of a hung parliament in 2010, but now getting to the sabotage of Gillard's campaign a second time. And, you know, it's different when you've been in these leadership positions and you know the cycle of getting past revenge. With Rudd, he hasn't got past that. So how do you explain it? I say you're getting into the realm of evil. Sabotaging your own party twice, Tony, is something you've never seen in Australian politics before. And unless you've got some other explanation for it, I stand by my statement.
We've got another question on this. It's from Dean Shaka.
Mark Latham, through your consistent, bitter and personal criticism of both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, do you accept that you have done and are continuing to do more damage to the Australian Labor Party than either of them have ever done?
Well, if defending Gillard consistently over the AWU allegations, defending the government's record in certain key areas of social policy reform, if that's a problem, I'm sure Gillard would take my comments over the past 12 months well ahead of anything Rudd's been doing through that period. But, you know, you really want to understand what's happened in the modern Labor Party. Go beyond the personalities, because in many ways Gillard and Rudd are a proxy for a bigger structural issue inside the Labor Party. In the 80s and 90s there were basically two stable factions, the left and the right, that were run by a couple of power brokers. But it's a long story, but to do with the evolution of union influence.
Can I just suggest that we will get to that story, because I know we've got questions about that. So can I just pause you on that point?
Well, I'm halfway through my story. It's,
yeah, we'll bring you back to that story. We'll bring you back to that story, though. Here's a quick question, though. If Bill Shorten, as the speculation is suggesting, were to withdraw his support from Julia Gillard in favour of Kevin Rudd, would that equate to evil?
Well, I don't see how Bill Shorten's been sabotaging Labor for 3 years, Tony, so I think the question's silly.
No.
What
happens if he does? What happens?
Well, I think it's a silly question. Where's the evidence Shorten's been sabotaging Labor actively, waking up every day and thinking, how can I do Gillard?
No, but if he makes the judgment now... If he makes a judgment this week.
Instead of silly questions, you should have let me finish the story, because it goes to the heart of the state of the modern Labor Party.
Our questioner's got his hand back up. We'll go back to him.
Yeah.
So are you seriously saying that you're not destabilising the Australian Labor Party at all with what you're saying, what you've been saying, what you have said over the last few years since your tumultuous time in Parliament ended?
Well, I haven't been a parliamentarian for 8 years. I haven't been in the federal parliamentary Labor Party for 8 years. And I try to write objectively about the state of play. And the point I was trying to make is that the factional system's disintegrated now to where if you go through the list of caucus members, there are 25 sub-factional warlords, 25 out of 100 odd in the caucus. So on average, each of them has got 3 followers. Now, you couldn't run a small business, a community organisation, a sporting club by having 25 people who've got influence. And what happens is that these sub-factional warlords cluster around a leader. They've got to be part of the manoeuvring, Machiavellian tactics. They've got to impress their small band of followers. And the modern structure of the Parliamentary Labor Party has descended into anarchy, chaos, to the point where just in the past week you've had members who've packed up their office supposedly solely for the purpose of telling the media about it. Now, Labor's got deep-rooted structural problems that need to be fixed. If you think that's destabilisation, that's your opinion. I actually think talking about it, as I did initially in the Latham diaries in 2005, and pointing to solutions can be part of the answer for the modern Labor Party.
Mark,
that's what I've been banging on about for 8 years now.
I'm going to pause you because we do have a question coming up with that, but I want to hear from our other panellists on this question that was originally asked about Julia Gillard, and I'll start with Malcolm Turnbull. Who do you think you will face at the next election?
Well, I don't know. For a long time I thought that it would be Kevin Rudd, because I thought, as John Howard always used to say, and still does say, the politics is governed by the iron laws of arithmetic, so logically they would bring Rudd back. But the depth of hatred in the Labor Party, and we've just had a little touch of it there, is so intense, it's quite frightening, actually. And I think that, you know, all I can say is that, you know, when Mark Latham says Labor has very, very deep structural problems, I think that's an understatement. I agree with him. I think, but there's a level of hatred and animosity there that I've never seen anywhere else in politics.
Well,
and those deep there's nothing, Craig. nothing like. In fact, let's have a look. Let's just look at that.
Oh,
I was defeated.
No,
I was defeated as leader of the Liberal Party by Tony Abbott. I haven't undermined Tony Abbott.
No, you've been good on that.
I haven't sabotaged
You have been
Tony
good on
Abbott.
that account.
I work with Tony Abbott.
I agree.
There are people. We have had different views in our party, but we are united, working in a common cause. The Labor Party is tearing itself to pieces.
But what's the common cause? To remove the price on carbon that you fully support.
Your common cause just seems.
Why would you do that? Why would you have a common cause to remove the price on carbon that you fully support?
Craig, the dreadful truth is, and Mark Latham has summed it up well, Labor is a hopelessly divided, dysfunctional rabble at the moment. It has to sort out its problems. It can only do that in opposition.
Haifaa, let me bring you in. You were living in Australia. You were living in Australia when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, and I'm just wondering, you've obviously watched from a distance the rise of our first female Prime Minister in this country. What are your thoughts about her potential demise?
Well, watching her speech on sexism was one of the most inspiring things happened to me as a female. Like, she was strong, she was like so full of herself and the passion, and it really empowered me, and I'm really, really far away at the time when she got. And for me now that like she's not very as popular as Kevin Rudd, maybe because she doesn't fill the traditional role of like she's a single woman and all that, and she is not, even if she works hard, sometimes women find a lot of like discrimination. But I feel, I'm an outsider, but I feel like the unity of the party is very important. And I think, as sad it makes me, I think she should give it to Kevin Rudd. He's popular and he will bring people together. And I'm totally an outsider, and she has to reinvent herself as a female and as a woman, and always stand behind her. And I think a lot of people will if she does the right thing and moves ahead. But yeah, I don't want to disagree in agreement with with Mark, because
okay.
I don't have that strength.
Let's go to our next question. It's from George Jovanovski.
Hi there. My question is for Mark. Mark, in a recent article, you spoke of your concern about the level of trade union control over the Labor Party. The union's control of the ALP is what led to the ousting of Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister and possibly fed into your decision to move on from the party. What should the ALP do to change the entrenched power of the unions, and who do you see as the new generation of Labor leaders who will drive a modernisation of the ALP and win back the trust from the public?
Well, on your second question, I think they're outside of the parliament. Labor has some young, bright, diligent people in their 30s who hopefully one day will form the basis of a much better government than what we've got at the moment.
Could you name some of them?
Well, I'm not going to put the kiss of death on them by doing that. Your point about union influence goes to my earlier point about the subfactions. In every state in the country, there's a union-based subfaction, probably 5 or 6 of them, and then you multiply that by the 6 states and you end up with these 25-odd subfactional warlords, again with the union base in the federal caucus, and it's institutionalised chaos. You just can't run a political party that way, let alone the government of the nation. And the answer to it is to ensure that everyone pre-selected to run as a Labor candidate is beholden not to factional bosses or union chiefs, but to the people in their electorate, to have community pre-selections. And I think the other thing that needs to be done...
You mean with a kind of primary election system in the way the Americans have? Yeah,
be beholden to the local electorate, which is how the Labor Party started out in its origins in the late 1800s. It was a community-based organisation. It's become now an oligarchy with these union-based subfactions. So you need to go back to the community roots as best you can. But I'd suggest the second reform, and that is to reflect on the fact that if they do change leader now, it will be the 6th leadership change in 12 years. Labor has got a revolving door of leadership where basically each of the last 5 leaders, I think it is, Crean, myself, Beazley, Rudd and now Gillard, have found the caucus to be ungovernable, to be unmanageable. And I think the caucus has lost the moral right to select the parliamentary leader. Labor should follow the example in other countries where it's selected by the party membership. And that, at long last, would stop the revolving door of leadership instability and would give the party a coherence and a chance to get behind someone for more than an average of 2 years, 6 leaders in 12 years, more than an average of 2 years, get some stability in place, some coherence, The current caucus has lost its moral right to pick the leader, and they should hand that over to the party membership.
I want to bring in Craig Emerson on this, but just before I do, a quick question to you, and that is, since you'd like to see union power broken somehow, and obviously through this primary system being your main objective, how do you actually do that if Labor is obliterated, as the first questioner suggested, in the coming elections? Because in the end, the real power will remain with the unions. There won't be very many Labor MPs. The unions will still be in control.
Well, out of crisis, you can get change. I don't think the party should be rewarding a saboteur. I think the party would be better advised to die on its feet than to live on its knees, as a matter of principle.
Even if that meant complete, well, really being reduced to a rump of a small number of MPs.
Tony, I give you this guarantee: history will not judge people well. History will not judge them well if they cave into sabotage and the threat of it in the future. Labor is always strongest when it stands on principle. And I get the feeling now that even reduced to a small parliamentary group, they've got a better chance of rebuilding for the future than giving in to the sort of bastardry that they've had to endure over the last 3 years from Kevin Rudd.
Craig Emerson, is that the way you look at things? It's better to die on your feet and live on your knees, or whatever it is.
I just don't share...
No, well, Peter Garrett sang it first, but I'm repeating the Garrett line.
Right.
Great working class man, Midnight Oil, that you are better off.
Actually, Craig is probably one of the few people on the panel, apart from Peter Garrett, who could probably sing that for us.
Well, but not tonight. Just in the wrap up. In the wrap up, I got a couple of tunes. All right. Just
he's a Whyalla Wipeout man.
That's right.
Skyhawks man.
Divided the nation. Anyway.
In my family, it was very popular. My 10-year-old boy still does an impersonation of you.
Good taste. I always said that about the Latham kids.
Magnificent.
No, on this, I am nowhere near as pessimistic as you are, Tony. Other people on the panel, I am not.
I'd say the journalists in this case are being sort of more realistic. Pessimistic doesn't really come into it.
All they're doing is saying, oh, look, there's an opinion poll taken here and taken there. That means this is what's going to happen in September.
Well, look,
now,
I mean,
you asked me a question,
that might have been the case if you were only talking about public opinion polls. Now you're talking about your own internal polling in Victoria, which is devastating.
It's the same
devastating for Victorian MPs who thought they were somehow immune to this.
It's the same consideration. I do not know of a period where opinion polls taken in June tell you what's going to happen in September. The question is usually, if there were an election held next week, what would you do? Now, we have had difficulties, there's no doubt about that. But the environment in which those questions have been asked is not an environment where it's Julia Gillard versus Tony Abbott in the contest of ideas. There's a lot of other noise around, there's a lot of other distractions and diversions, and you can understand why people would say, well, hold on, get your show together. That is a fair enough comment. If we can get past this period, then it will be Julia Gillard and her ideas and Labor's ideas against Mr Abbott and his ideas, which I personally consider dangerous for Australia. That is my view. I think Tony Abbott is a danger to this country.
But the problem with that is, of course, is not just the polls in June. It's consistent polls over a very, very long time. And Kevin Rudd, in that sense, was right to say stop looking at alibis for the reason that the Gillard government is not doing well. I mean, the reason that Kevin Rudd continues to be relevant over all this time is that the Gillard government is not popular and has not performed well. And to say that's all Kevin Rudd's fault is ridiculous.
So where has the Gillard government performed poorly? You know, we're growing stronger than any developed country in the world. We're growing stronger than any developed country in the world. We've got massive education reforms, made sure low-paid workers get decent pay. We've put a price on carbon, and this is all really bad news. I mean, the alternative is this extreme austerity that Campbell Newman's practising in Queensland. Tony Abbott says they'll have a commission of audit after an election, and that's when they will reveal the cuts to spending that they say are essential for reviving an economy that is actually growing faster than any advanced country in the world.
I think it's very hard to argue the government's kind of economic management when you've got so many confusing messages coming out.
Performance
for example,
counts.
Well, exactly, performance counts.
Yeah, and where is it falling down?
There you have, for example, the idea of the budget. We were all going to be in surplus, and suddenly we've got $20 billion of surplus, and we actually do have an economy
deficit,
which is slowing down. In deficit, and we do have an economy which is slowing down. You've got a bit of the overhang still going from the resources boom, that is clear, but there is that is going to end in the next couple of years or next year or so. You can see that happening already. What is taking its place is actually not clear at all. And I do think that people have lost faith in the government's ability to manage the economy.
Record low interest rates, low inflation. Record low interest rates, low inflation, unemployment about 5.5%. We're AAA rated by all international ratings agencies. Never happened in Australia's history. Our debt is 1/8 of that of the major advanced countries. And Australia, by the OECD itself, was rated the best country in the world 2 weeks ago. You wouldn't know it because it wasn't reported, not just on the economy, but a range of indicators.
Can I interrupt the stream of talking points just for a minute?
There's no bits of paper here, Tony.
No, but I imagine...
And by the way, I take offence at that. I take offence at that. I come here with some ideas that I'm happy to share with your audience, and I will put those. So the fact is that the OECD analysis rates Australia as the best country in the world.
Can I just ask, in that case, if everything is going so well, why are you being smashed in the polls?
Well, I think that there are.
Well, Tony, it could be worse. If you dropped into Australia and just heard 2GB in Sydney and read the Australian newspaper and listened to all that News Limited negativity about the government.
You've forgotten the Australian Financial Review, Mark.
Well, and Jennifer's column in the Financial Review.
Mark, is this as opposed to the positive write-up you're giving them tonight?
If I can just finish my comment, which is if you dropped in and didn't know much about what had been going on, you'd think, oh, this contest is probably 65% for the Liberals, two-party preferred, 35 Labor. So the fact that it's around 55-45, I put down to two factors. The strength of the economy. People out there in the suburbs and the regions have never been more affluent, never been more employed, never been doing better in terms of small business formation. We do have the world's miracle economy. And all rabbiting on about the politics ignores that fundamental fact about Australia, which I think is a terrible shame. And the second factor is the unpopularity of your mate Abbott, who's not well liked in the electorate, Malcolm, and you said that when you lost the leadership and gave him a good old pizzling, and what you said then was true.
Okay,
what you said then was true. So both those factors have brought it down to a tighter contest than you'd otherwise expect.
You do get a right to reply there.
I held great hope for you. I thought you were very encouraging in what you said about the climate change denial.
And then signed up with the direct action
plan. Very good.
Well, I just, look...
but then you turned.
Well, Tony, there's a I think was it Napoleon who said you should never interfere with your enemies when they're destroying themselves. So I don't know that there's a lot that I can contribute to this sort of self-immolation down the other end of the table. But for Craig to say that the government is doing a fantastic job, the economy's being really well managed. I mean, look, let's be frank. We've gone through a huge terms of trade boom, a mining boom. And what has Labor left us with? A string of deficits, despite promising surpluses, despite guaranteeing surpluses. They've delivered deficit after deficit, the largest in our history and the largest debt in our history. I mean, it is the economic mismanagement of this country in a time of huge prosperity is one of the great wasted opportunities of our times.
Well, hold on.
That's Labor's legacy.
John Howard came in, and when he was in, we had a massive mining boom, and that was completely
squandered. And we paid off all your debt, and we ran surpluses.
And invested nothing.
You've had a massive mining boom, and you've spent all our cash, run up the debt, and run deficits.
Invested in infrastructure, invested in skills in this country, and the reason that the interest rates went up 10 times after John Howard promised in the 2004 election to keep interest rates at record lows, they went up 10 times because of so-called capacity constraints, which is just two words for skill shortages and infrastructure shortages. Yes, we have invested in infrastructure, including the national broadband network, which you bag really every day, and I think, well,
that's fabulous.
You asked the audience whether they're in favour of the national broadband network or not.
It's going. The national broadband network's going so well.
I think it is a good investment in the nation's future.
Okay, here's a question.
Go back to the copper wire.
Here's a question. The national broadband network will be lucky if it meets 10% of its rollout target by 30 June this year.
Why would you tear it up? Why would you tear it up, Malcolm? You're a progressive guy. Why would you come in and say we're going to tear this up? Stop it.
It's not there to tear up.
You are not. There's nothing to tear up. Correct.
Okay, that is the point. That's that's a point. Sorry, that's a point for me to jump in and stop
anything.
this side debate. You're watching Q&A. We're going to change the subject to a very different subject. The next question comes from Annie Nevin.
My question is to Haifaa. As a woman who's grown up in a conservative Islamic country run by Sharia law, how much importance do you place on the right of the individual to control their own destiny? And do you consider the right to self-determine as being in conflict with the traditional values of your society?
Very good question. And it is, I think it's very relevant and very current. And because Saudi Arabia, apart from being very Islamic, very religious, it is also very tribal. And the tribe controls the individual totally in Saudi Arabia. Like they cannot get married, they cannot have very personal, they cannot take very personal decisions without being part of the collective. And I think, but now with a lot of like modern ideas, we have a lot of kids who are not anymore just in Saudi. They go outside for education, they go outside, they see virtual reality in Saudi, like online, existent on Twitter and Facebook. It changed a lot of the ideas. But it is slow. It is not like it's not going to happen overnight, but it is changing. And I think definitely the individual should be empowered. And I think it is very important to give that, to help steer the country in that way.
Can you explain to us how your film Wajah is part of trying to change the culture in Saudi Arabia? A lot of people won't understand, but it's a film about a young woman and her struggle to actually find some form of freedom.
Yeah. I think Saudi Arabia is changing a lot. There is a room now for women, for arts. It is not like, it's not radical change, but a change of mindset. And it's very interesting because the Middle East, there's a conservative wave across the Middle East, but when it comes to Saudi Arabia, the country is going a little bit into the other direction. And that is very cool, I feel. Because
you say cruel?
Cool.
Cool, I beg your pardon.
Because it is, even if it's a small, it allowed me to make a film. I filmed in Saudi Arabia with permission, and the film is about empowering young girls of following their destiny, following their, not destiny, their dreams, and having a space for their own. And it is, yeah, and it is very much about an individual who does not want to be part of the collective. She wants to be who she is. And for me, it is like a very simple thing. It's not a very big political message, but I think it empowers people to change and push to the right direction. And
it's all about a kind of, also about a sort of repression within this all-girls school that this young woman goes to. She's trying to break away from that repression. I mean, how serious is that as an issue?
Well, of course, like schools, and it is part of the system reinforcing the values. And I grew up, for example, in very traditional. I come from a small town. I'm one of 12 kids. I'm number 8. So, but my father is very liberal. They don't speak English, and we didn't travel a lot when I was little, but I had a little bit of a space at home. But once I step outside to school I know exactly where I exist in the scheme of things. And for me, yeah, that really needs to change. And that is why I rebuilt my school, and I put this little feisty girl in there, the hustler, just like trying to maneuver the system and use it to her advantage.
We have another question for you. It's from Lena Ibrahim.
Do you think that the media, for example, your movies, have negatively portrayed Saudi women? And do you think we need to start focusing on positive things Saudi women have been doing rather than the negative restrictions?
Well, there is a Saudi woman making a film, coming to Sydney, representing women. I think this is definitely breaking the stereotype in Saudi Arabia.
I meant like your movies themselves. I mean, instead of just talking about all the restrictions that the little girl had, riding the bike, couldn't we just talk about all the positive things that have been recently the Saudi women have been doing?
Lena, have you seen the film?
No, I haven't. I've seen the trailer.
Maybe we need to discuss that when we have a scene, because a lot of people think when we speak about Saudi and we talk about reality that we are negatively portraying the country. For me, it is very important to give this a human face to the culture. When we are in Saudi, is always portrayed in politics and economy. Nobody knows how we are and how our houses, how we sing, how we eat, how we fall in love. And it is very important to move away from like we are being portrayed as negative or as bad or stuff like that, as how are as people. And I'm sure you will enjoy the film because it is about progress. It's about embracing a dream and moving ahead and just like embracing your potential as a person. And even if it is hard, even the world is really heavy on women in Saudi, it is very important to not focus on that as much as focus on the hope and how to move ahead.
There's another questioner beside Lena with a hand up. Briefly, because I want to bring in the panellists. Go ahead.
Just watching, I've watched a bit of the movie, and my best friend has been born and raised in Saudi. And so I disagree, because he's the most progressive person. So I sometimes feel that with the Middle East, we're getting a negative view. And I think we need to, that women in Saudi can follow their dreams. She's a doctor, and she's managed to achieve all of that within Saudi. So I don't think the restrictions are as bad as you're saying, or that women cannot follow their dreams.
Well, let's ask, could we have this discussion openly on television in Saudi Arabia?
Of course, we have a lot of things are happening in Saudi. Things are changing, and I agree with Lena. My girl is exactly like Lena maybe when she was a little. Like, it is hard for me to become a filmmaker. People used to send letters to my father telling him, you are because it's tribal, our relatives, they will send him letters. They will take the time, write the letter, mail it to my father and telling him, you are an honorable man, you are a good man, you are a man coming from a good family. How would you dare, how would you let your girl appear on TV? We have this pressure on women. And it is, for me, I cannot make a film and ignore that. But that is not what I focused on. I focused on bringing the soul in this little girl. And it's very important to nurture that, nurture her and give her the chance to be. And I think it is exactly like you, Lena, maybe when you were little.
Let's go to Malcolm Turnbull. Do you think art has the power to actually change society and change politics?
Absolutely. I think the more people that hear you speak, the more will be moved. I think that was so beautiful what you said, so poetic. Like, we come from a family of poets, of course. But
here we go.
But no, I do. Of course, art does. I mean, life imitates art more often than art imitates life. Let's be frank. So I agree. I think this is very revolutionary.
Jennifer, can I just bring you in? I mean, it's quite interesting talking about Saudi Arabian women. We have a perception. I mean, the perception that I have is that it's a place where women can be stoned for committing adultery, but here we're getting a completely different view.
Well, I was in Saudi, it was a couple of decades ago, and I was actually fascinated by almost the inner life of women and the private life of women that because I was a woman, I was actually able to participate in. And I found that just an amazing experience, that, you know, the parties they had, but in their homes and behind the black veils and things. So it was just an amazing life. But I do think there's no getting away from the fact that women in Saudi Arabia are as Haifaa said, I mean, they've got a very heavy weight upon them of the world and the way the religion they're treated in that society. So I think that the more films like this we can see, the better. But I don't think we can just say, and that proves everything, you know, because we've had some experiences where young women have done very well in Saudi, that means it's fine for women in the country. Clearly it's not. I mean, in the same way that you can say, you know, here we're talking about a very, very different circumstance. But clearly every woman in the audience would have come across sexism at some time. It's a question of how you deal with that.
Mark Latham.
I just don't know enough about the society, Tony, to add to the discussion. You're better getting another comment from Lena than from me.
Craig Emerson?
More broadly, I think the progress of women is a stuttering progress at best. You know, they strive, they seek the sorts of opportunities that blokes have had for thousands of years, and when they do, they often find that they're up against resistance, a brick wall. You think of that poor little girl who the Taliban shot in the head because she wanted to go to school. She did go to school and she encouraged other girls to go to school. Now that's an extreme example, but that's what, you know, young women can be up against around the world. Another girl was doused with acid because she wanted to have a boyfriend who wasn't designated by her parents or someone else to be the right and just boyfriend. I mean, these are basic rights that I think women around the world do not enjoy, and I think women and men should back them in and continue making progress because it's not satisfactory.
All right, now we're going to go back to a question that's central to our politics at the moment. Sorry about that, Lena. We've had a long discussion on this, relatively. We go to Tom Nielsen.
It's been 10 months since the no advantage policy and offshore processing were implemented, but people still continue to take desperate journeys by boat, and many of them sadly continue to drown. When will our leaders and our politicians admit that simplistic policy responses of trying to deter and trying to return people are naive and don't work?
Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, I don't know what you mean by simplistic, but the sorry history of this policy is this. When John Howard's government, which I was a member, of course, lost office in 2007, we had not had any significant numbers of boat arrivals for many years. A mix of policies which had evolved over that time, some of which had been inherited from the previous Labor government, had succeeded in stopping the boats, as it were. Kevin Rudd took the view that the thing that caused the boat arrivals to increase or decrease was the situation in the Middle East. It was the push factors. It was what's happening in Afghanistan, what's happening in Iran. And we said at the time, no, it's the pull factors. It is Australia's domestic policy. Kevin took the view that was not the case.
You're on the record, Malcolm, as saying the push factors are enormous. You are on the record as saying that.
Can you just be quiet?
No, I won't.
They want you to be quiet. The point that I made at the time was that the push factors range from being enormous to very enormous.
Right.
But they are always enormous. And what calibrates the level of arrivals is Australia's domestic policy. Now, Kevin took the view that was not the case. He changed our domestic policy. Labor conducted a social science experiment which has had the consequence of thousands of unauthorised arrivals, hundreds of boats, lives lost and billions of dollars of money spent on trying to handle it. So it has been... Labor conducted a failed experiment.
Okay.
And that is why you've got to get back to the policies that work. That is the melancholy truth.
That is the point. So
that is the point.
The policies that work, according to Tony Abbott, towing back the boats to Indonesia. Will that work when the Indonesian ambassador says you can't do it? When the Indonesian foreign minister says he won't accept that? How will that work?
Well, you can only return boats when it is safe to do so. But the fact is...
What about when the Indonesians agree or don't agree?
Well,
that's the other factor.
Tony, that may render it unsafe to do so. The fact is, there was a mix of...
That's the uniform position of the Indonesian government.
The thing that Labor cannot escape, they are like a butterfly on a pin on this issue. They are stuck. The truth is... The policies they inherited worked, they changed them, and we are in the mess we are today.
Except everyone... But we're into the next phase now, where everyone wants to know how the coalition is going to deliver on the promise when the Indonesians say they won't take these people back. So how do you think that's going to happen?
Well, look, the bottom line is this, Tony. We had a mix of policies which worked when we were in government.
No, but the fundamental one, towing back the boats, which virtually everybody agrees is the thing that finally stopped them happening. Can you do it
I'm not
if the Indonesians say no? Can you do it if the Indonesians say no?
Tony, look, obviously, if the Indonesian Navy were to intervene in some way to prevent it happening, it obviously wouldn't happen.
No, but what if they just said, you can't do it? They wouldn't have to intervene. They just say, you can't do it, because to bring them in would be like an invasion.
Well, that's not true. That is not true.
If you took them back to Indonesian ports and said, now go ashore?
No. The practice that occurred... Well, let me put it this way. If you engage in megaphone diplomacy, it won't work, right? But the bottom line is this, that if seaworthy asylum seeker boats are taken back to the limit of the Indonesian territorial waters, escorted back there and then left there so that their only option is to return to Indonesia, then the Indonesian Navy is not engaged because it is action that is not occurring within Indonesian territorial waters. There's never been any suggestion and there's never been any practice of the Australian Navy escorting asylum seeker vessels through Indonesian waters and tying them up at a wharf in an Indonesian port. So the proposition that you've put to me, with great and grovelling respect due to, your magnificence here, is simply not based in fact.
Okay,
it's not factual.
The questioner had his hand up again. Let's go back to you before we bring in the other panellists. Go ahead.
In response to Malcolm, the factors which cause the boats to stop are a lot more complicated than that. At the same time, global applications for asylum dropped. But regardless, this discussion always goes around in the same circle. If those policies had worked, they ought to work now because the current government has very similar policies. What I'd like to know is why we're so focused on trying to deter people or return people or penalise people without looking at what's wrong with what's not working in the channels which we'd prefer them to take, or in the case of Sri Lanka where people come directly, the circumstances which are causing them to flee.
Well, if I could just answer that very briefly, I think...
Yes, you can, very briefly, because I want the other panellists to answer.
I think the fundamental problem that you've got is that there are tens of millions of people in the world who are fully qualified as refugees. Let's say if they got to Australia, they would qualify for refugee status. No matter how generous our humanitarian program is, there is always going to be a large number of people who won't be able to get in through the traditional sort of conventional route, and will want to get in under their own steam, as it were. And that is that people smuggling trade, which for all the reasons that I think most Australians now agree on, is one that we've got to work out a way to stop. And therein lies the challenge.
Okay, Craig Emerson.
Well, I've just heard Malcolm astonishingly defend and actually support a policy of towing back boats into Indonesian waters. So far has Tony Abbott dragged the Liberal Party to the right that Malcolm Turnbull, who I consider a decent man, is forced into a policy of supporting towing back boats into Indonesian waters when everyone from right through the system, the most senior ministers, the leadership said they will not tolerate it. Now, to have any response that is effective to this problem, you need the cooperation of Indonesia. You will not get the cooperation of Indonesia if you start towing boats back. We won't do it. You've just defended it. I think it's indefensible. It's dangerous. It's dangerous for the Navy. It's dangerous for the people. When I talk to the head of the Immigration Department and to people in Indonesia from within our embassy, they'll say they'll scuttle them straight away. There'll be people in the water. There'll be people drowning. What do we say? Let them drown? No, we don't tow the boats back.
If it's not safe to tow them back, in the 11 years of the Howard government, there were 6 boats that were escorted back to Indonesian waters. 6. It can only happen when it is safe to do so, and there will be cases where it is not safe to do so.
It's never safe to do so.
But Craig, the problem that we've got is that you guys have created this mess by dumping our policies, and now you're saying that there's no solution to it. So your attitude is you throw your hands up and say
we can't get the legislation through the Parliament that you and your colleagues oppose. We cannot get the legislation through the Parliament that you and your colleagues oppose. Now, what happened at around the time of the change of government is that people smugglers learned that of all those people on temporary protection visas, a huge proportion of them were allowed to stay in Australia after being in mandatory detention for a very long period. They then told those who wanted to come by boat, don't worry about it, you'll end up being able to stay in Australia because these TPVs are just a deterrent for a period of time, but if you're patient enough, you'll be able to stay.
OK, I'm going to pause you two so we can hear from the other panellists. We've got a question to bring the other panellists in. It's from Esther Sainsbury.
Oh, I had a question for Mark Latham. Given the issue of asylum seekers will likely be a central issue to the 2013 election, what advice do you, as a former Labor leader, have for the Labor Party?
Well, with hindsight, it would have been better off if the Labor government hadn't changed the regime and policy settings that had been in place in 2007 for the reasons that Malcolm's outlined. But the situation now is the greatest humanitarian crisis facing the nation. That so many boats, so many families, so many people have drowned is just horrible beyond belief. And it's insufficient to have bickering politicians playing a blame game. It would be good to think about some form of deterrent. Personally, I think that turning around the boats and taking them back should be tried because of the extent of the crisis. The Indonesians will never agree. The truth of it, to speak bluntly about it, is that the Indonesian corruption on the ports, the police, the army, facilitates the people smuggling, doesn't stop it, we know that. It facilitates the people smuggling. We're talking about a major problem here and we're better off confronting that. The Indonesians won't agree, but it should be tried in an exercise almost like calling their bluff and say to them, look, you've been facilitating this problem, you must accept responsibility for the solution. No government, no decent person with any sort of heart would stand by and watch these families, these children drowning on the high seas between Australia and Indonesia. So take it up in that policy approach and see if some result can be achieved, because we just can't sit back bickering about it. It needs some sort of action. Abbott hasn't confronted the Indonesians honestly, said this face to face with the Indonesian president. He needs to do better. I think the current government needs to do better, and hopefully, you know, for the sake of these poor souls, we do find some kind of solution.
Just before you do that, I just want to drag you back to politics just for a minute. I mean, you're saying John Howard was right.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that when I was leader of the Labor Party and the policy settings we had, they were wrong. Howard was right. And there comes a time in politics and public life, Tony, where the thoughts lying in bed at night thinking of young children drowning on the seas, you know, who gives a crap about parliamentary politics? There comes a time to call the truth and to act on it. And this is such a time.
Jennifer Hewett.
Well, I think to Malcolm's point about megaphone diplomacy not working, I think that's very clear. I think the Abbott government will make a very determined effort to have a quiet negotiations with the Indonesians, and I don't think you can write off that possibility that there will be some impact out of that and some quiet lessons.
Do you agree with Julia Bishop then that the Indonesians are saying one thing in public and another thing behind closed doors?
Well, I think it's certainly worth trying, and I do think that to say something in public is a lot different, particularly in Indonesia, than it is to what you actually agree to in private. But I do think that Tony Abbott's suggestion that he will stop the boats by the end of the first term is incredibly optimistic, because for all the reasons that both Mark and Malcolm have said, I mean, the whole situation has now got out of control. I also think that the current Labor policy of having people, when they arrive, and they do keep arriving in their great numbers, and then putting them into the community but not allowing them to work, is one of the most boneheaded kind of responses to this type of thing that I've ever heard of.
So I'm going to move on to another subject entirely. We've just got to come back to Mark Latham one more time, because one of your former colleagues recently said this issue is absolutely killing Labor in the western suburbs where you come from. Is that true?
Well, I don't really care, Tony. I'm interested in the people who are dying on the high seas. You know, I'm not interested in the politics of it. This is sort of journalistic in play, you know, in the Beltway stuff. Let's talk about the solutions, and political analysis will sort itself out on the 14th of September.
Okay, our next question is from Celia Addison-Cook.
In the same week that a young man nearly died when punched in an unprovoked attack on a Sydney street, New South Wales Rugby League captain Paul Gallen was given a token one match ban by authorities for punching Nate Miles in the face during the State of Origin game. Why is violence during sport treated with such nonchalance and often excused for being part of the game? And why are no politicians taking any leadership on this issue of violence in sport?
Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, I think that you've raised a very real concern, and this is a huge issue in every city, and particularly in this city, in Sydney. Street violence, and it's getting worse. And I think that violence in sport certainly provides some examples of it. I don't see why there should be any lenience in professional sport for people engaged in, you know, in punching, in violent activity that is well outside of the rules. Let's face it, there is enough toughness and violence, physical violence, that can occur within the rules in rugby league without having to break the rules. And I think that the public concern about the light sound, I'm not going to talk about the particular case, but the public concern about the sort of shrugging it all off as all part of the game is very legitimate. And I think it's one of the reasons why other sports, other winter sports, soccer is a very good example, are becoming more popular with young boys and girls.
Mark Latham.
I don't see the link. Did that tragedy in the middle of Sydney happen because John Hopewade put an elbow to the head of Keith Galloway 6 or 7 years ago in a Sea Eagles Sharks game? Of course it didn't. It's more likely a product of alcohol abuse, drug consumption, someone who's got some other problems in their life. There's been a lot of punches thrown in rugby league over a long, long period of time, over 100 years.
And celebrated by commentators as being the key moments. In fact, in this case, the Paul Gallen's 2 punches, which it seemed to me came out of thin air, the other bloke wasn't fighting.
Well, he was pushing.
It was, and so in response you punch him?
Well, no, Tony, let's put this in perspective, OK? There was a brawl in the Saints-Knights game on the weekend. Nobody talks about it. Not many people put the focus on it. There was a fight in the Parramatta Roosters game. Gallen's sin is twofold. One, he connected, and the second, the Tut-Tut Brigade got onto it through the media and drew this spurious link with drunken violence in the streets of Sydney.
Is it really spurious, though? I mean, if someone can commit common assault on a sporting field, why wouldn't young people think you can do that out in the streets?
It's not common assault. The bloke who hit Nate Miles said, look, this is part of the game, it should stay on the field. In fact, he got me a good shot. Good luck on him, we'll square up in the next match. It's part of rugby league culture. Now, there's one easy answer for people who don't like it, Tony, if you don't like it. Turn over to Offspring on Channel 10 instead of watching State of Origin or whatever's on the ABC on a Wednesday night, because this has been happening in rugby league for 100 years. In fact, if you want to be objective about it, you should be giving rugby league authorities a bit of a pat on the back, because the violence problem now on the field is just a mere shadow of what it used to be 20 or 30 years ago.
Craig,
it was a bloodbath. So what we've got now is minor indeed.
Let's hear from Craig Emerson.
Well, that's right. Go back to 1970, the Battle of Headingley, where the Pommies headbutted the Australians into submission, smashed their noses across their faces with the Liverpool kiss. This is a celebrated time in Australian rugby league history. I don't agree with the celebration
as the Paul Gallen double punch was celebrated by the commentators as the turning point in the match.
Yeah,
indeed, this is my very point.
If you like rugby league, you love that incident, OK? Bring back the Biff.
But this is my very point. The league cannot at the same time condemn the violence and then promote it in the highlight reels. You have a look at that State of Origin coverage, the most promoted, the most reported upon incident in that game was those 2 punches from Gallen on Nate Miles. So you've got the league saying, this is deplorable, so let's make sure that we put it in the highlights reel. I saw a highlights reel from the former State of Origin. They didn't last for 2 punches. They lasted for 10 minutes sometimes, dragging them off over the sidelines, up into the dressing sheds, 2 blokes walking up in the dressing shed, smacking each other, and the commentator saying, this is great, this is terrific. You can't have it both ways. If the league wants to condemn it, do so, but don't celebrate.
What about you? Are you condemning it, or it's a bit hard to judge what your actual attitude is?
I agree to this extent with Mark. I don't think it's directly linked to drunkenness in the southern parts of George Street and Pitt Street, but I think there is too much violence in the community, and I think that lots of alcohol very late at night in cities like Sydney. This trouble doesn't tend to occur at 10 and 11 at night, but at 2 or 3 in the morning when they're blind drunk and violent.
All right, I just want to hear, we've heard from a few blokes. Let's hear from Jennifer Hewett.
Well, at the risk of being called part of the Tut-Tut Brigade by Mark, I do think...
Tut-tut, aren't you?
I'm going to... I do think that there is a problem with sport and violence, and the fact that we celebrate it and that rugby league celebrates it is an issue. I think it does have an indirect influence on kids. I mean, my own 20-year-old boy, watched it and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, Mum, stop fussing, it'll be fine."
Stop tutting.
Yeah, stop tutting. But it creates an environment where just belting someone for the sake of belting someone is celebrated. And sure, you don't, then immediately rush off the sporting field and head into Georgetown and get drunk and hit someone as well. But I think it's part of a general culture where a kind of level of violence is actually regarded as okay, often celebrated, and not too bad at worst until there's some shocking incident happen. And the fact is, you actually feel safer walking around the streets of New York than you do in Sydney. You can't blame rugby league on that, but I do think it's an issue for all of Australian society to consider.
Can I just make one point?
Brief one.
These guys are all professionals. They're all professionals. They make a lot of money. If the penalties for gratuitous violence, breaking the rules like that, were more severe, there would be less of it because it costs them money when they can't play. So that's the fact.
OK, well, just before we go tonight, we're nearly out of time. We have a chance for one last video question to Mark Latham. It's from Michael Britton in Mirrabooka, Western Australia.
Mr Latham, writing in The Spectator in August 2011, you said that you were once asked to appear on Q&A, but that you would rather visit the dentist. You also said that the program is for media masochists who look forward to 1 hour of self-flagellation. How do you feel about those comments now?
Well, as you can tell, I'm a very compassionate person, and I'm here tonight for the benefit of the two great Australian media nutters, Gerard and Anne Henderson, because they were running a campaign on their blog to get me back onto TV. But I'll tell you what, there's a lesson in this. You just can't please some people. Because here I am back on TV to help them out. They've been suffering Latham deprivation syndrome. And they're still critical of me being here tonight, you know. You just can't help some people. You can't please them under any circumstances. Gerard hasn't been the same since I got off Sky News, because instead of writing 50 letters a day to people who apparently misquoted him in 1989, he's only been writing 25. So he's a shadow of his former self, poor Gerard, and I'm here to help him tonight. I'm in the dentist chair for Gerard's sake, not that that ungrateful bastard appreciates it, of course.
And you've still got all your teeth.
I've still got all my teeth.
That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Jennifer Hewett, Craig Emerson, Mark Latham, Haifaa Al-Mansour and Malcolm Turnbull. Thank you. Next Monday, we'll be joined by the Minister for Sport and Multicultural Affairs, Kate Lundy, the Shadow Minister for Regional Development, Senator Barnaby Joyce, Editor-at-Large of The Australian, Paul Kelly, writer and academic Robert Mann, and the Director of Melbourne University's Festival of Ideas, public health advocate and former Australian of the Year, Fiona Stanley. Until next week's Q&A, good night.